Trump sent a veiled threat meant to intimidate AOC, but instead of backing down, she went live, stayed calm, and turned the entire country's attention in her direction. It wasn't the first time things had gotten tense on the House floor, but this time felt different. The air that day in Washington was thick, not with heat, but with friction. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had just delivered a fiery 5-minute rebuke aimed at several far-right lawmakers during a session on domestic extremism. Cameras caught every second of it. No theatrics, no stumbles, just precision, frustration, and something that sounded a lot like truth. She called out hypocrisy. She named names without hesitation. Her tone was firm, her words measured, but piercing. It wasn't just about policy, it was about how certain members were using fear and nationalism to blur the line between party loyalty and danger. No one spoke to her after the speech, not even to argue. But people looked. Some glared. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Everyone in the chamber knew she'd struck a nerve. That evening, the clip made rounds on social media. Clipped, captioned, stitched, debated. And then Trump responded. Not directly, not with a tag or a name, just a post on Truth Social that read, "There's a young socialist troublemaker in Congress running her mouth again. Someone should remind her. There are consequences when you lie about the people who built this country. She better watch herself." There was no name, but no one needed one. The timing, the tone, the illusion, it was aimed at her, and everyone knew it. Within the hour, the post had already gained traction online. Screenshots popped up on Twitter, Reddit, Facebook. Pundits debated whether it constituted a threat. Late-night talk shows mentioned it with uneasy laughter. And AOC? She stayed silent. No tweets, no interviews, no public statements. At least not yet. A few hours later, a reporter caught her outside the Capitol. She looked calm, even tired, but her voice was steady. When asked about the post, she said only, "We're looking into it." Inside her office, her team was working overtime. They were used to managing storms, but this one was different. It wasn't a Fox News segment or a viral meme. It was the former President of the United States sending out what felt like a warning. A threat dressed in vague language. Something that could be dismissed, sure, but only if you weren't the one being talked about. By the next morning, the story had taken over headlines. Conservative commentators defended the post. "It's just Trump being Trump," they said. "He didn't name her. He didn't threaten violence." But others saw it differently. Politicians on both sides of the aisle began issuing statements, carefully worded but clear. This isn't normal. One clip showed up repeatedly on cable news, a CNN panel revisiting Trump's exact words. A legal analyst said, "We have to ask, if this weren't Trump, would this post be investigated?" But in the noise, something more insidious began to form. Conspiracy posts, anonymous threats, digital harassment. AOC's team quietly contacted Capitol Police and made sure her schedule would be adjusted. Security was heightened. Some called it paranoia. Others called it preparation. Meanwhile, AOC sat in a closed meeting with senior staff and one of her closest aides, a soft-spoken woman named Karina Morales. The two had been working together since her first term. Karina looked up from her laptop. "We're getting thousands of mentions an hour. People are scared. They're angry. And it's not just bots this time." Alexandria didn't speak for a few seconds. She tapped her pen against the table. "Then we tell them something real, not a clapback, not a meme. I want to talk to them directly." Karina hesitated. "You sure? That'll light everything up." "I'm sure," she said. "They want to scare us. Let's make them hear us instead." But what came next wasn't silence. It was a firestorm. The live stream began without warning, no countdown, no promo, just a simple shot of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sitting alone in a plain gray sweater, hair tied up, back against a neutral wall. The phone sat still on a small stand, tilted slightly up toward her face. No studio lighting, no filters. The comment section exploded within seconds. Her name climbed to the top of trending lists again. People had been waiting, refreshing her profile, speculating on Reddit, texting each other to keep watch. She looked straight into the camera and started without a smile. I wasn't going to say anything publicly about what happened. Not yet. But something's been bothering me, and I think a lot of you feel it too. Her voice was low but clear. No notes in front of her. No script, just her thoughts, unfiltered and raw. Yesterday, the former president posted a message that a lot of people took as a threat. I'm not here to argue about whether it's technically one. What I care about is this. He knows exactly what kind of response that kind of language provokes. She paused for a moment, letting the silence settle. And he did it anyway. She reached beside her and picked up a sheet of paper, printed screenshots of the Truth Social post. She held them up to the camera, then she read it word for word. As the comments streamed faster, her view count surged. 100,000, 300,000, 800,000, a million. By the time she finished reading the post aloud, nearly 2 million people were watching live. I've reported this to the Capitol Police, she continued, not because I'm afraid of Donald Trump's words, but because I'm tired of pretending that words don't have consequences when they come from someone who still has millions of followers ready to act. There was no yelling, no posturing, just calm certainty. And that's what made it hit harder. She shifted slightly, folding the paper and placing it off camera. You know, I talk a lot about policy, about justice, about what needs to change, but I don't often talk about what it feels like just to exist in this space. As a woman, as a Latina, as someone who didn't come here from a political dynasty. She looked down for the first time, took a breath, and looked back up. Do you know how many threats I get in a week? How many death threats go unreported because they've become background noise? Do you know how often I have to explain to my family that we're safe, even when I'm not sure? A comment popped up in real time. We got your back, AOC. She smiled just faintly when she saw it. This isn't about me being tough. I am. I've had to be. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let people normalize this kind of behavior. Not from someone who once held the highest office in this country. Then came the shift, what turned a response into something bigger. She started naming other women in Congress who'd been targeted, not just Democrats, Republicans too. She told short, human stories. A voicemail left on a colleague's phone, a stranger lurking outside someone's office, an envelope sent with no return address. Her voice didn't shake. If anything, it grew stronger. Politics isn't just bills and votes and debates. It's the space between all of that. The stares, the messages, the isolation, the quiet moments where you wonder if it's worth it. Another comment appeared. Don't stop, please. She looked straight into the camera. I won't, but I want you to understand. It's not just me they're trying to silence. It's every young person who speaks out. Every woman who demands to be heard. Every person who refuses to sit back and accept what we've been told is just how it works. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She didn't beg. She simply told the truth. And the internet erupted. Within hours, clips from the live stream were circulating everywhere, edited for TikTok, translated for international platforms. Hashtags filled up Twitter. #We stand with AOC, #not afraid, #this is leadership. Even those who didn't agree with her politics found themselves quietly admiring how she handled it. It wasn't performative. It wasn't calculated. It felt like someone saying, enough. One journalist on MSNBC called it the most controlled act of public courage I've seen from a sitting congresswoman in years. Her team didn't release a press statement. There was no need. The live stream was the statement. And by the next morning, her message had made it into classrooms, across dinner tables, and into offices where politics usually never came up. But the impact wasn't just digital. It was deeply human. The next morning, Alexandria sat at her kitchen table in a Washington apartment that barely looked lived in. A chipped ceramic mug sat beside her laptop. The remnants of last night's tea had long since gone cold. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours, but she didn't feel tired, just focused. Karina knocked softly before entering, holding her phone. CNN wants a follow-up, NPR too. They're calling what you did a landmark moment in political speech. Alexandria glanced up. Let it breathe. We said what needed to be said. Karina hesitated. They're also asking if you feel safe. That question lingered, she answered with a shrug. Define safe. While she reviewed a stack of district casework, texts poured in from colleagues. Some encouraging, some apologetic, some oddly silent. But what stood out were the DMs. Thousands of them, some threatening, some clumsy attempts at discrediting her, and others unexpectedly kind. A high school civics teacher from Kansas, a retired Army nurse in Nevada, a college sophomore in Fresno who wrote, "I've never seen anyone say exactly what I feel, but don't have the words for. Thank you." She read that one twice. Meanwhile, across the country, her live stream was being dissected in real time. Panelists replayed the moment she held up the printed post. Analysts froze frames to show the steadiness of her hands, the tone of her voice, the lack of fear. But it wasn't bravado. It was deliberate control. Later that afternoon, AOC returned to Capitol Hill. No fanfare, just a black coat, dark jeans, and her usual black boots. Inside the building, the atmosphere had changed. Colleagues she passed in the hall nodded without speaking. Others looked away altogether. That was always the split, those who respected her and those who wished she'd sit down and wait her turn. She never did. In a closed-door committee meeting that afternoon, she entered the room and found Congressman Ray Belden already seated. A Republican from Wyoming, Belden was known for his blunt style and his long memory. He gave her a long look as she walked in. "You all right?" he asked without any sarcasm. She raised an eyebrow. "You tell me." Belden leaned back. "I don't agree with 90% of what you say, but what happened online, that was out of line." That was all he said. No handshake, no compliment, just a short, unexpected gesture of decency. And in a place like this, that meant more than most people realized. That evening, while she drafted an amendment for an upcoming energy bill, Karina walked in holding her laptop. "You've got to see this." She turned the screen. It was a video. Someone had edited together clips of AOC's live stream, layered with videos of young girls watching on phones, women speaking at community events, even men with signs that read, "Silence no one." It wasn't polished. It wasn't viral because it was flashy. It was viral because it felt real. "This isn't about Trump anymore," Karina said. "This is about everything that led to that post in the first place." Alexandria set the laptop down and sighed. "Yeah, and now people are finally listening." At 8:17 p.m., her office released a single tweet. "We're not backing down, not now, not ever." Within an hour, it had 1.2 million likes. What followed wasn't a media blitz. AOC didn't hop from show to show. She let the public carry the weight of her message. On TikTok, teenagers started using clips from the live stream to make side-by-side reactions. In Portland, a group of middle schoolers wrote letters to their state rep, quoting lines from her speech. In Phoenix, a university professor used her video in a lecture on modern political communication. But even as her message inspired, the threats kept coming. The Capitol Police briefed her team on increased risks. Some messages included addresses. Others made references to events she'd never spoken about publicly, details only someone with access to internal documents could know. That's when things shifted from digital to personal. Late one night, after returning from a town hall in Maryland, she sat alone at her window, scrolling through photos from the event. In one image, she was laughing with a woman holding a baby. In another, a high schooler had his arm awkwardly around her shoulders, both of them grinning. Karina texted, "You did good tonight." She replied, "They showed up, I had to." Then she added, "This is bigger than him now." But the impact wasn't just political, it was starting to move hearts. By Thursday morning, the story had morphed into something no one could ignore. Cable news anchors leaned forward with urgency. Headlines across political spectrums now featured AOC's name next to words like threat, fear, and reckoning. Trump's post had backfired in a very public, very loud way, and this time, the silence that usually followed his provocations didn't come. Instead, it got noisy. It started with Senator Eliana Kraft from Oregon. A centrist Democrat known for rarely getting involved in public disputes, Kraft posted a thread calling the post reckless and dangerous, and warning that words like those from a former president carry consequences far beyond social media algorithms. Then came Representative Jonas Greer, a libertarian from Idaho. His tweet read, "If someone said this to me, I'd report it. Doesn't matter who you support politically. Threats, even veiled ones, don't belong in American discourse." That one went viral, and it broke the dam. Soon, a wave of elected officials, celebrities, and academics began weighing in, not just defending AOC, but calling for action. Several lawmakers pushed for a formal ethics review into Trump's post. By that afternoon, the House Ethics Committee confirmed it had opened a preliminary inquiry. Meanwhile, Trump doubled down. He posted again on Truth Social, mocking the outrage, calling it performative outrage theater and adding, "She should be flattered anyone still paying attention to her." That only threw more fuel on the fire. Back at AOC's office, they'd stopped reading the comments. The noise was too loud to keep up with. Instead, they focused on one thing: maintaining her schedule. She had 3 virtual events, a podcast interview, and a meeting with an advocacy group focused on voting access, all things that had been planned long before this crisis started. She showed up to every one. At a Zoom panel with college students from Texas, she addressed the elephant in the room. "I know some of you are probably here today because of what's happening, and I appreciate your support. But this work we're doing, it's always been about more than any single moment. That's how they try to stop you. They make the moment so loud, you forget your mission." Later that day, while walking to her car, a group of reporters spotted her in the Capitol parking lot. One yelled out, "Congresswoman, do you feel like Trump crossed a legal line?" She didn't slow her pace, but she answered, "I think people already know the answer to that, and they're responding with their voices." The camera flashes didn't stop, but she did, for just 1 second, and turned. You can't scare people into silence anymore. That time is over. That clip made every major evening news broadcast, but not everyone was applauding. Far-right influencers, YouTubers, and commentators began spinning the narrative. They claimed AOC was exaggerating. They said the threat was made up. They posted side-by-sides comparing her to political figures they accused of crying wolf. One pundit went so far as to say, "She's using this for clout." Her supporters fired back. Old interviews resurfaced showing how often she'd spoken about threats and safety long before this moment. Journalists found archives of FBI reports listing real arrests tied to threats against her. A podcast host played recordings of voicemails she had once received, messages filled with venom and violence. The shift was happening in real time. This wasn't just about AOC anymore. It was about something larger. A culture where powerful men said things with just enough ambiguity to dodge consequences, and a system that let them do it again and again. A sign was taped to the door of her district office in the Bronx that read, "We're not afraid, we're watching." Another clip surfaced from an elementary school in Michigan. A group of girls, ages 10 to 12, had watched her live stream during social studies. Their teacher asked, "What did you take from this?" One girl stood up and said, "She didn't yell, she didn't cry, she just talked like she knew who she was." That moment was shared more than 3 million times. As the media kept dissecting every frame and every word, AOC remained steady. No new live stream, no new tweets, aside from official updates. Her silence in the days that followed spoke louder than more commentary ever could. People began using her restraint as a contrast to the chaos surrounding Trump's camp. They called it maturity, leadership, grace under pressure. In private, though, the tension was building. Karina entered the office late Friday evening with 2 thick manila folders. "We got another batch of threats forwarded from the platform's legal team. It's getting worse." Alexandria didn't look up. "Forward them to Capitol Police and the FBI liaison." Karina hesitated. "You sure you don't want to take the weekend off? Just a day? Go back to your mom's place?" AOC looked at her, eyes unwavering. Not yet, but the story was far from over. The building buzzed with low murmurs and distant elevator chimes as AOC stepped into the Capitol's restricted access wing, flanked by 2 plainclothes officers. It wasn't part of her usual routine, but after everything, some adjustments were no longer optional. She hated the sound her boots made in those quiet hallways, each step echoing a little louder than it should have. Down the corridor, a secure meeting room had been reserved for a briefing. 2 agents from Capitol Police were already waiting, along with an FBI liaison. Karina was there too, tapping on her phone, jaw tight. The lead agent, a gray-haired woman named Rena Dow, motioned for everyone to sit. "We've confirmed multiple accounts involved in the recent threats are tied to known extremist forums," she began. "They're coordinating language, testing limits to see what slips through content filters." AOC listened closely, her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the table. "Any credible threats?" she asked. "We're still vetting," Rena replied, "but several have referenced specific dates. We've flagged those for escalation. Surveillance has been increased. For now, we recommend minimal public appearances unless absolutely necessary." She hated that phrase, "unless absolutely necessary." If they had their way, she'd be a voice trapped in a screen. That wasn't why she ran for office. Karina spoke up next. "Some of the threats are getting oddly specific. Personal things. Her father's name, her childhood school." Rena gave a nod. "We think someone might have dug through older public records. It's nothing new, but it's more targeted now." A heavy silence followed. AOC leaned forward. "I want to make something clear. I'm not going to disappear. You can increase my detail fine, but I still have town halls. I still have community meetings. People need to see us working, not hiding." Karina's voice softened. "You can be brave and still be safe." "I know," she said, "but we can't treat visibility as a luxury. Not in moments like this." After the briefing, she returned to her office. The hallway outside was empty, lights dimmed to save power. The door creaked a little when she pushed it open, old hinges that never quite got fixed. On her desk, a stack of unopened letters sat waiting. She didn't always have time to read them herself, but lately she'd been trying to go through at least a handful every day. There was something grounding about it, tactile, human. She picked up the first envelope. The return address read, Canton, Ohio. Inside was a handwritten note in careful cursive. "I'm 76 years old. I've voted since I was 18. I never thought I'd write a politician, but I want you to know, I saw that video. I saw the strength in your voice. I believe in you. My granddaughter does too. Thank you." She paused, holding the note for a moment longer. Another one came from an 11-year-old boy in Seattle, crayon on lined paper, stick figures. He'd drawn her holding a megaphone with the caption, "Keep talking, they can't stop you." A small smile crept across her face. Karina knocked gently and entered. "You've got that interview with the international press in 20 minutes. They're asking for comment on the ethics review." AOC nodded. "Let's keep it simple, no dramatics." As Karina turned to leave, AOC added, "Hey, what would you do if it were you in my position?" Karina paused at the door. "I'd be scared, but I think I'd do what you're doing, only if I really meant it." That night, they left the building together, escorted by security. The cold outside bit at their skin, but it was quiet, peaceful in a strange, artificial way. Streetlights blinked in regular intervals. AOC looked up at them as they passed. "Do you ever think about the cost?" she asked quietly. Karina didn't answer right away. "Yeah, but I also think about what it would cost not to do it." They stood there for a second, breathing in air that felt heavier than usual. Inside the car, AOC's phone lit up with a new message. It was from a retired congresswoman she admired deeply, someone who had chosen to leave public life early after facing relentless attacks. It read, "They'll keep testing how far they can push. Just don't let them rewrite the rules while we're still on the field." She saved the message, locked her phone, and stared out the window as the city blurred past. But she refused to let fear dictate her next move. On Saturday morning, in a strip mall outside Flagstaff, Arizona, a coffee shop posted a handwritten sign on their door. "Women who speak truth deserve to be safe. We stand with AOC." It wasn't a chain or a political hub, just a place that sold muffins and quiet corners. But someone had felt the need to say something, and across the country, similar messages were starting to appear. In downtown Milwaukee, a muralist began sketching a street-facing wall with the phrase, "Courage is louder." In a public library in Spokane, a group of volunteers held a teach-in on digital safety and female public figures. Even in smaller, conservative-leaning towns, discussions were happening. They weren't all supportive, but they weren't dismissive either. The threat may have started in Washington, but the reaction had spread far beyond it. AOC didn't try to direct the momentum. She didn't post curated updates or orchestrate appearances. She let people carry the conversation in their own ways. Still, her staff forwarded her links from time to time, messages that had cut through the noise. One was from a high school in Oklahoma. A social studies teacher, Mr. Castillo, had let students write open responses to the live stream. One girl wrote, "I didn't think people like her actually felt scared. I thought they were just used to it. Now I know they're not, and that makes me respect her more." Another from a single mother in Cincinnati, "I showed my daughter your video, and she asked me what 'watch herself' means. I told her it means keep going." Inside the Capitol, though, things were becoming less supportive. Some lawmakers were growing nervous about the public attention. A few privately encouraged her to let the issue cool down. One even suggested she post a message of reconciliation, something vague and non-committal to smooth things over. She didn't respond to that suggestion. Instead, she kept working. She met with healthcare organizers from Southern California who'd flown in on their own dime. She held a listening session with environmental advocates from Minnesota. During a virtual event with teen activists, she was asked, "How do you stay calm when so many people are trying to scare you?" She paused. "I don't stay calm. I choose not to be silent. That's different." The kid nodded like that made perfect sense. Back in her district office in the Bronx, the phones rang all day, not with complaints, but with gratitude. A retired bus driver called to say he'd never voted for her, but wanted her to know, "What you did, that was strength." A high school counselor called crying, saying her students had written letters after watching the video. Then came the town halls. She hadn't planned on speaking publicly again so soon, but her team received a request from a community center in Allentown, Pennsylvania. They were hosting a roundtable about political rhetoric and wanted her input. She agreed on one condition: no media, No live stream, just people talking. Inside the community room, a folding table was surrounded by a dozen attendees, nurses, postal workers, teachers, retirees. No lights, no press, just conversation. An older woman in a red windbreaker leaned forward. When he posted that, I remembered something my husband said to me back in '68 after a protest. He said, "It's never about the words, it's about who's listening to them." A young man added, "We're all listening now. Whether we like you or not, we saw how you handled it. You didn't blink." That word again, didn't blink. It kept showing up in articles, comments, conversations. AOC smiled slightly. "I didn't blink, but I did feel it." That's what people forget. We can feel the fear and still keep going. Afterward, she stayed behind to help fold chairs and thank the organizers. No cameras, no statements, just presence. Later that week, a small but noticeable shift appeared in polling across a few battleground districts. Voters who had previously listed AOC as too radical now described her as strong, composed, or simply real. No one claimed it would change an election, but something had moved. She noticed it most in letters from women over 50. They weren't always fans of her politics, but they understood something deeper. The tension of being underestimated, of being dismissed, of standing your ground when it might cost you. Karina printed a few and taped them beside AOC's desk. One note, written on a yellow legal pad, said, "You reminded me that being scared isn't a weakness. It's just proof that what you're doing matters." But for AOC, the noise meant responsibility, not rest. On a mild Tuesday morning in Sacramento, a woman named Noelle Abrams walked into her union meeting with something tucked under her arm. It was a printed transcript of AOC's live stream. She laid it flat on the table in front of her and said, "I want to start here today." Noelle wasn't a politician. She drove buses for the city. 42 years old, mother of 3, raised in Vallejo, and not someone who typically quoted elected officials. But something in AOC's calm that night, the way she didn't flinch, didn't posture, had stirred something in her. "I've been talked down to by men in power my whole life," Noelle said to the room, "and I've been told to smile through it." Watching her speak without trying to charm anyone, I don't know, I felt like she was standing up for all of us who've been told to sit down. The stories kept multiplying. In a grocery store parking lot in Topeka, 2 elderly women stood beside a pickup truck holding small signs that read, "Truth deserves protection." They weren't activists, they weren't even online much, but they'd heard the broadcast on public radio and felt the need to do something. And in an art class in Tulsa, a 17-year-old sketched a charcoal portrait of AOC's face from the paused live stream still. No dramatic flair, just her eyes looking dead on, eyebrows slightly furrowed. She titled it "Steady." Alexandria's team saw some of this through forwarded messages and local news clippings, but the weight of it couldn't be measured in likes or trends. It lived in a more quiet, personal space, the kind that didn't beg for attention, but held it anyway. That week, AOC received an invitation from a group of Black and Latino women legislators from across the country. They weren't asking for a campaign rally or media spotlight. They just wanted to gather in Washington to talk, share strategies, stories, fears, and what came next. The room they met in was small. Tired carpet, plastic water pitchers, no press. 22 women sat in a circle, some in blazers, others in jeans. They passed a talking stick, not out of tradition, but because everyone had something to say and no one wanted to interrupt. One woman from Florida, State Representative Carmelina Ruiz, leaned forward with both elbows on her knees. "When you went live," as she said, "I was hiding in my car outside my office. Someone had sent a picture of my house to my personal phone. I was shaking so bad I didn't want to walk inside. But I watched you talk, and something about the way you sat there, in silence before you spoke, it gave me just enough to open that car door. Others nodded. A representative from New Mexico said she had played the clip for her teenage niece. A local official from Indiana admitted she nearly quit last year after being harassed for supporting reproductive rights, but had since reconsidered. AOC listened more than she spoke. That's what struck them most. She wasn't there to lecture, she was there to be with them. But not everyone saw her gathering support as a sign of unity. Back in D.C., a few political pundits dismissed the movement as optics, emotional politics, or a coordinated pity campaign. One conservative magazine published a headline that read, "From bartender to martyr, AOC's greatest performance yet." The backlash didn't go unnoticed. Karina slid the magazine across the table in their office later that day. "You want me to respond?" Alexandria didn't even glance at it. "No, let it rot on the shelves." "But people are running with it." She looked up. "Then let them. I'm not in this to defend my existence." Instead, she called a press conference, not about herself, but about an overlooked federal bill protecting public officials from digital harassment. She didn't bring up Trump. She didn't talk about the live stream. She didn't even mention the threats. She talked about policy, about consequences, about the future. And for many watching, that decision said more than any soundbite could. Afterward, a reporter from a local station asked her if she thought this moment would define her career. "I hope not," she said. "I hope what defines me is what we do after the noise dies down." Still, the noise hadn't died. Not completely. Threats continued to arrive, filtered through mailrooms, inboxes, back channels, some vague, others graphic. Her security remained tight. Her team moved with care. But behind all of it, something stronger had begun to form. It wasn't just admiration, it was alignment. Women across the country who had once viewed AOC as too bold, too loud, too progressive, were now reconsidering. They didn't suddenly agree with every policy, but they recognized the strength it took to show up day after day knowing the risks. They knew what it felt like to be told to quiet down. And for once, they saw someone who refused. But for all the praise, threats still lingered. It was a brisk morning in Columbus, Ohio, when Representative Lydia Shore stepped out of her black sedan and paused briefly at the bottom of the Capitol steps. She was moderate, deliberate, rarely dramatic, and yet today she was carrying a manila envelope in her hand like it was on fire. Inside were printed screenshots, metadata, and a detailed timeline. Evidence. Not of a smoking gun, but of a pattern. She wasn't alone. Over the past 10 days, pressure had been quietly building behind closed doors. What began as an outcry over Trump's vague threat toward AOC had grown into something institutional. Congressional staffers were comparing notes. Capitol Security was tracing networks. Legal advisors were weighing thresholds. And now, the Ethics Committee had scheduled a special session. No press, no cameras, just one room, 14 members, and a stack of reports thicker than any of them expected. The hearing wasn't about what Trump said exactly, but about what came next. The consequences, the social unraveling, the escalation of threats, the silence from his camp. Alexandria wasn't invited to the session, she wasn't part of the committee, but she was asked to submit a written statement. Instead, she requested to speak directly. It wasn't common practice, but the chair agreed. She showed up with a folder in hand and one page inside. When they called her in, the room fell quiet. No one expected her to be nervous, but there was something extra in her walk. Not arrogance, calm gravity. She didn't read from the page. Instead, she stood, hands lightly resting on the podium, and spoke plainly. "You all know what happened. I'm not here to explain it. I'm here to remind you what we allow when we pretend that silence is leadership." She paused. One of the committee members shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When a former president says something laced with implication, we all hear it. But the problem isn't just what he said, it's what followed. The digital abuse, the credible threats, The normalization of women, especially women of color, being treated as disposable. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't tremble either. I was told to let it go, that I was giving him what he wanted by responding, but if we let people get used to this, we're saying it's fine to threaten public officials, as long as it's coded, as long as it's slippery. She closed the folder. I've got a job to do. I'll keep doing it. But this place, this committee, needs to ask itself who it protects when it does nothing. She turned and walked out without waiting for questions. Later that day, snippets of her closed-door remarks leaked. Not recordings, just descriptions. But they were vivid enough to spread, and the public took notice. Again. Meanwhile, her team met with federal cybersecurity consultants to coordinate monitoring of the online threats. The FBI quietly confirmed several profiles had been flagged for federal review. 3 arrests were made in separate states, none directly connected to Trump's post, but all referencing the incident. Still, AOC didn't celebrate. She didn't post victory tweets or make statements. If anything, she became quieter, more precise. A week later, at a public education summit in St. Paul, Minnesota, she was asked during a panel, "Do you think Trump should be prosecuted for the threat?" She took a moment before answering. "I think the law will do what it does. But this moment isn't about punishment, it's about precedent. Because if people watch this and think silence kept me safe, they'll try to survive by being quiet, and I won't feed that lie." Meanwhile, a new conversation was growing, this time on college campuses and in legal blogs. Professors debated the boundaries of political speech. Students held forums on power dynamics in social media. Editorial boards penned columns titled "Free Speech versus Conditional Violence." Even late-night television, normally eager to make jokes, started approaching the topic with more seriousness. One host, typically known for sarcasm, said, "She didn't just stand up to a former president, she stood up to a culture that treats threats as content." And within the Capitol, staffers began pushing for a formal protocol, a bipartisan security and harassment response system. Modeled after whistleblower protections, it aimed to create reporting processes that didn't rely on political pressure. AOC supported the draft. When a young reporter caught her in the hallway, they asked, "What made you push for this now?" She paused, adjusting the strap on her bag. "Because it shouldn't take a camera going live for people to be taken seriously." But the real shift happened where cameras couldn't reach. Late October brought a strange kind of clarity to the Midwest. In Springfield, Missouri, a local bookstore set up a display near the entrance. 4 books about women in politics, a framed printout of AOC's most quoted line from her live stream, and a note from the owner that simply read, "For my granddaughter." It wasn't loud, it wasn't organized, but it was happening, this quiet shift, this ripple of attention and reconsideration. In Dubuque, Iowa, a retired machinist named Walt Barnes stood up during a town hall meeting and surprised everyone. "I didn't vote for her. Hell, I didn't even like hearing her speak before," he said. "But the way she handled herself? I respect that. She didn't act like a victim. She acted like someone who's tired of being pushed around." The room was mostly silent. Then someone clapped. Then another. It was a single moment in a small town, but it carried the same tone as dozens of others cropping up across the country. Moments where the conversation started to shift, not toward ideology, but toward integrity. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had never aimed to win everyone's favor. But something about how she handled the threat, head-on, unflinching, refusing to be baited, had cracked open something unexpected. People were starting to separate their politics from their perception of character. That was new. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, a high school civics teacher named Rachel Mulvaney held a class discussion on leadership under pressure. She played the live stream in class, then asked, "Is leadership loud or is it measured?" A student replied, "It's when you're being watched and you still do the right thing." The teacher nodded. "Even when it's not popular?" The student shrugged. Especially then. Back in D.C., AOC's team noticed the shift too. The numbers weren't massive, but they were consistent. Polls in swing districts showed a subtle improvement in her favorability, particularly among older women and moderate men who previously viewed her as divisive. They still didn't agree with her on everything, but they saw something in her tone, in her control, that was hard to ignore. Karina scrolled through the latest analytics report one afternoon, then looked up at Alexandria across the office. You know what's wild? We're getting more engagement from people over 55 than under 35 right now. AOC glanced up. What kind of engagement? Letters, phone calls, Facebook comments, long ones, thoughtful ones. Alexandria leaned back in her chair. They're not used to seeing someone like me stand still when someone comes for them. Karina smiled. Nope, but they like it. At a fundraiser dinner in Cleveland, the topic came up again. A group of donors, mostly small business owners and educators, chose to spend most of the night asking her about how she kept her cool, not why she spoke out. I've been a teacher for 22 years, one woman said. And the way you stayed composed reminded me of the days I had to hold the line in front of a classroom full of chaos. That's leadership. It's not yelling. It's not clapping back. It's just standing there, steady. Back in her hotel room that night, AOC sat on the edge of the bed scrolling through old videos, her own included. She studied herself, not for vanity, but to understand the way her voice carried, the pace she used, the moment she paused after reading Trump's post aloud. She wanted to know why it worked, because next time it might not be a live stream. It might be a hearing, or a press conference, or a funeral, and she had to be ready to meet the moment again. At 2:11 a.m., she opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence. The only thing louder than rage is stillness. Outside of the political bubble, things were changing in quieter ways too. A small church group in Bakersfield organized a Women in Public Life seminar. A synagogue in St. Louis held a talk about digital harassment and resilience. And in rural Ohio, a librarian added her live stream to a list of modern civic speeches worth watching, alongside King's I've Been to the Mountaintop and Barbara Jordan's 1974 speech on the Constitution. That one stunned AOC the most. She read it in silence during a layover, then closed her laptop and just sat with the thought. People weren't just hearing her, they were placing her, not as a hero, not as a saint, but as someone who had done something hard and hadn't blinked. But the most powerful part wasn't in politics. It was in people. The first frost of November dusted the ground outside a community center in Grand Junction, Colorado, as a line of people wrapped around the building. No signs, no campaign gear, just neighbors waiting to hear a guest speaker talk about truth, threats, and the cost of being public. It was a quiet gathering, organized by a local civics group. They hadn't even announced the speaker until the night before. When Alexandria stepped onto the small stage, people rose to their feet, not in applause, just in stillness, like they knew something important was about to happen. She wore a black turtleneck and slacks. No makeup crew, no aides behind her, just a single mic and a simple folder in her hand. I didn't come here to talk about politics today, she said, looking out across the room. I came here to talk about what happens when someone tries to shut you up and you speak louder by saying less. The crowd was silent. When I went live that night, she continued, I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know if people would care. I didn't know if it would cause more threats. I just knew I couldn't pretend it didn't matter. She glanced down, then back up again. And what surprised me since then is how many of you told me you felt like you were sitting in that room with me, not watching a politician, just watching someone trying to hold it together and say what needed to be said. She talked for 15 minutes about digital fear, about control, about how silence sometimes feels safer than truth. Then she paused. "I don't want to be known as the woman who got threatened and made a good speech," she said plainly. "I want to be known as someone who didn't let that threat become a reason to shrink." From the back, a voice called out, "You didn't." She smiled briefly. That afternoon, a student at a nearby college who'd never voted before registered for the first time. "I didn't agree with her before," he told a friend, "but she showed me what it looks like to stay steady when the ground shifts." In Kansas City, a 72-year-old woman emailed AOC's office with a short message. "I've never seen a young woman carry that much weight with that much grace." A week later, Alexandria returned to the House floor, not with a fiery speech, but with a simple amendment to a housing bill. Routine, practical, no cameras. But her presence felt heavier. Some colleagues who once avoided her now paused in the halls to exchange a few words. A few even asked questions, real ones, curious, respectful. It wasn't friendship, it was recognition. That's all she ever asked for. Back in her district office, Karina brought her a stack of thank you notes. Some were typed, most handwritten. A few were drawings from kids who had seen their mothers cry during the live stream. One note stood out. It came from a woman in Birmingham. "You reminded me that leadership isn't about being loud. It's about standing still when someone's trying to push you over. I've been quiet in my job for too long. Not anymore." AOC read it twice. Later that night, in her apartment, she finally took a moment for herself. Just her, a mug of tea, and a window cracked open to let the fall air in. She didn't scroll social media, didn't check messages, just sat there, eyes unfocused, remembering what it had felt like in the moment before going live. The heartbeat in her ears, the choice between fear and honesty, and the clarity that came once she started speaking. She had no illusions that things were resolved. The threats hadn't stopped, the critics hadn't vanished. But something had shifted, because somewhere out there, a girl was watching. And now she wouldn't feel alone. Somewhere, a woman was being told to be quiet, and now she might speak louder. Somewhere, a person was facing something ugly, and now they knew they could name it. This wasn't about going viral. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about naming a line and refusing to let anyone erase it. And in doing so, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had done more than respond to a threat. She had turned a veiled warning into an open conversation. She had made fear visible and made it powerless. She had reminded the world that even the loudest voices can't drown out someone who knows exactly who they are. If this moment left you thinking, questioning, or moved in any way, subscribe, share the story, speak up, because sometimes the simplest truth is the one they try hardest to silence.